Just while Michelle's doing that, if at
So,
any time we run into any technical problems, you can use the questions to type me in. If you lose her or if you're having trouble seeing the PowerPoint, please just let me know via the message system and we'll work on resolving that issue. Keep going, Michelle, sorry.
and Rachel, can you see this now?
Yes, it looks
The
great.
PowerPoint that's flipped up?
Yep,
Okay,
it looks
perfect.
perfect.
So our primary purpose at the Institute for Economics and Peace is to try to put metrics behind levels of peacefulness. We do so in an attempt to understand what trends are happening in the world, to try to think about peace in a more tangible manner, to understand the economic impacts of violence and peace on economies, and to look from a statistical standpoint at what the drivers of peacefulness are. So our core product that we put out every year is called the Global Peace Index. We've now been doing the Global Peace Index for 9 years. It's a ranking of 162 countries around relative states of peace, and it's a composite index. And so this means that we take a lot of different factors and we put them together to come up with one single score to try to basically simplify a very complex a complex issue like peacefulness. So here we're using 23 indicators. They all have different weights. We work with a panel of experts and with the Economist Intelligence Unit on all of the collection and collation of data, on the methodology, on determination of weights, review of data, so that we have this three-part sort of peer review process for the index each year. Now, it's important to really understand what we're actually measuring in this index. So we use a definition of negative peace for the Global Peace Index, and negative peace is the absence of direct violence or the absence of fear of violence. So really when we're looking at the Global Peace Index, we're looking at levels of violence around the world and relative levels of violence. But that's really only one part of peace. You can have an absence of homicide rates, for instance, but it doesn't mean that you have the societal structures that will give you the resilience you need to be able to sustain those lower levels of violence. So you need, for instance, also to have inclusive justice systems. So those aspects of the attitudes, institutions, and structures that sustain peace are part of positive peace. And we look at something that we call a positive peace index around that, and I'll touch on that a little bit more later. But it's really just important to understand that with the Global Peace Index, we're looking at a measurement really of what you don't want in society versus with positive peace, we're looking at what you do want. So, as I said, we have 23 indicators in the Global Peace Index. 6 of them measure domestic and international conflict, and this is everything like number of deaths from conflict, relations with neighboring countries. We have 10 measures of societal safety and security, including incarceration rates, number of refugees, and 7 measures of militarization. It's important to note that with the indicators is that they're both a mix of quantitative indicators, so we're using data from administrative sources, for instance, and qualitative indicators. So 7 of the indicators that we're using involve expert assessments to try to fill data gaps and for things where we might not have administrative data. Perceptions of criminality in society would be one example of one of our qualitative indicators. And also important to note that we're looking here at both internal levels of peacefulness and external levels of peacefulness, so that when we bring it all together, we're having a much more holistic and comprehensive view of these relative states of peace. So this is what the Global Peace Index for 2015 is looking like. And when you're looking at the map here, it's good to just think about the variations that you see. So red would be the least peaceful areas, green the most peaceful areas, and you see concentrations, but you also see a lot of regional differences, which is pretty interesting. So looking at the highlights for this year, and this is, what have we seen over the past year for the Global Peace Index? So the average level of peacefulness has remained about the same. However, 81 countries became more peaceful while 78 countries deteriorated. And this is really about levels of internal conflict and interpersonal violence that are driving these deteriorations. So you see that it's primarily driven by deaths from internal conflict, terrorist activity, and a lowering of UN peacekeeping funding. But there were some improvements in homicide rate, external conflicts fought, and political instability. I will qualify, though, that once again, this is over the past year. So we're looking at countries, for instance, in the Middle East and North Africa, which might have been more embroiled in conflict and have gotten slightly better. So when we look at some of these particular indicators, we see things like external conflicts fought. 24 countries have improved while 41 have deteriorated, and that's mostly a legacy of previous years' conflict. Whereas the impact of terrorism, we've seen 18 countries deteriorate while 12 have improved. When we continue to look at just some of the top line highlights, Syria remains the world's least peaceful nation. So after 4 years of civil war in Syria, we've estimated between 220,000 to up to 310,000 people have lost their lives. You have 6.5 million displaced people in Syria now. 4 out of every 5 Syrians are living in poverty. And that's contrasted with Iceland, the most peaceful country, again, in the Global Peace Index. And one example for Iceland really is the story that came out that in December 2013, it was the first time in modern history that a citizen has been killed by police fire in Iceland. So it's a stark contrast there. In terms of the countries that have shown the largest improvement, Guinea-Bissau and Côte d'Ivoire have shown the largest improvements, and that's really countries that were in conflict and have started to rise out of it. So we've seen peaceful elections in Guinea-Bissau that have increased stability there. And in Côte d'Ivoire, we've seen after 4 years from the post-electoral crisis, which caused many deaths, a cooling of the conflict there. The countries that have decreased the most in peace have been Libya and Ukraine over the past year. And interestingly, Europe as a region, the peace in Europe has improved, and this is partially because Europe has shown more resilience and higher positive peace factors, but also largely driven by withdrawals from Iraq and Afghanistan by many European countries. For the first time, the Middle East and North Africa is the least peaceful region. And so you see a stark contrast between Europe's improvements and MENA's deteriorations. And just to look really quickly at the United States, given that we are here right now, the U.S. is ranked 94th out of 162. So since the Global Peace Index has come out since 2008, the U.S. has improved 5%, primarily because of improvements in Iraq and Afghanistan. But the U.S.'s score still is held down by things like incredibly high incarceration rates, our nuclear and heavy weapons, our weapons exports. So I think sort of more interesting than just looking at what's happened over a 1-year period is to look at the 8-year trends in peace. And I think this also has more applicability for funders in the field. If we're looking at 8-year trends, then we can really see across the indicators, which ones are improving, which ones are deteriorating, and what does that mean for where our threats are and where we should concentrate our efforts. So overall, we see that since 2008, peacefulness has been decreasing in the world. And so when we're talking about levels of peace reaching lows in the Global Peace Index, I just want to make it clear that we're talking about the history of the Global Peace Index, which is from 2008. So there's often questions about looking at the history of humanity or Steven Pinker's work on how we're in the most peaceful periods in history. And this is, yes, we have gotten much more peaceful in terms of humanity, but we're seeing these obvious and impactful threats coming from internal conflicts and coming from different types of ways of thinking about war and peace than we're used to. We're not talking about war between countries as much anymore as we're seeing threats coming from within countries, from political instability. So in terms of the safety and security score for the Global Peace Index over the past 8 years, there's been a over almost 4% deterioration. The militarization scores across the world have improved by about 2.5%, and the ongoing conflict score has deteriorated almost 1%. And so we're really seeing these levels of internal conflict driven by deaths from internal conflict, driven by increases in refugees and internally displaced peoples, driven by the impact of terrorism, violent demonstrations, and criminality. External conflict, as you can see here, has actually gotten much better. So if we look just quickly at some of those indicators and looking at what really the threats are right now, terrorism does stand out. And here you see the great increase in number of deaths from terrorism from about 2011 onwards. And this is really concentrated, though, and that's important to remember, is that the largest impact from terrorism is concentrated in countries. So you have places like Nigeria driven a lot of the terrorism impact in terms of number of deaths. In 2013, sorry, I just got a notification from GoTo. In 2013, the number of countries that lost over 50 lives to terrorist attacks reached 24. And this is the largest number of countries. And that also represents an additional 9 countries compared to 2012. So although there's this great concentration, it is starting to spread. And the countries that are now experiencing these impacts include Algeria, Central African Republic, China, Egypt, Lebanon, Libya, Mali, Sudan, and South Sudan. Looking at refugees and IDP, you've seen that the number of internally displaced people has increased by over 300% from 2004. And now almost 1% of the world's population are now either refugees or IDPs. And this is the highest level since the end of World War II. Just last week, I believe, or the week before, the UN released the newest figures that have even increased since we were able to include it in the Global Peace Index. So this number has been increasing. And we look at where they're coming from and where they are, it's really concentrated in 5 countries: Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, and the DRC. 63% of the total of refugees come from just 5 countries, and 77% of IDPs come from 5 countries, where you see Colombia being a factor instead of Afghanistan in terms of IDPs. And then I just wanted to touch quickly on homicide rates as a threat. And to do that, I'm going to close out of this PowerPoint, if that's possible. Hold on. And just pull up this map online. Rachel, can you see the map?
There's a little delay, I think. We're still on the PowerPoint, but it looks like it's moving towards, there's the map. Yeah, I see it now.
Okay. So just so that everybody knows, the report is available on our website, visionofhumanity.org. And we have all of the methodology clearly laid out in the back of the report. We will provide data sets to researchers by request. So that is also something that I can handle for you if you're interested. But we also map all of the information online, and I just thought it would be slightly more interesting than looking at a bunch of graphs to look at the homicide indicator on the map. So here you see the 2015 Global Peace Index. You can go by year and see how it changes. And if you go into the corner and you specify indicator, you can go down to homicide. And the reason I want to bring up homicide is that homicide is actually a threat. Interpersonal violence is a concern. So 9/10 of violent deaths are from homicide. And the global homicide rate has increased 17% between 2005 and 2012, which is an additional 95,000 homicides a year. So this is many more deaths than from something like terrorism, for instance. But this trend is also concentrated in places like the US, Western Europe, many areas of the world. Homicide rates are declining. But increases in homicide are really coming from Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. So 7 out of 10 countries with the highest homicide rates are in Latin America, and 3 are in Sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see that here. If I go and start the heat map at 2008, you'll see, look at which countries then become red and which ones start to become yellower and greener as I move along. You'll see Mexico joined the pack there. And now we see a concentration. I'm going to just flip back to my PowerPoint. And finally, in terms of looking at threats, I wanted to look quickly at urbanization, because urbanization itself is not a threat to peace. In fact, we see that countries that have higher levels of urbanization tend to be more peaceful countries, and this is primarily a result of economic development. But when we look at what to expect, by 2050, 1.9 billion of the 2.5 billion more people living in urban areas. So this great growth that we're now going to see in urban populations, 1.9 billion of them will be living in countries with low levels of peacefulness. And this is a problem because it means that we need to be able to try to manage this urbanization so that it doesn't become a threat to societal safety and security. To address this, we need to look at investments in improving rule of law, in addressing fairness and group grievances, and looking at income inequalities. When we're looking at correlations between violence, peace, and levels of urbanization, that's where we see necessary investments, is that urbanization can be a force for peace if it's combined with inclusive justice institutions, strong rule of law, low levels of group grievances, and lower levels of income inequality. And then finally, just going to one of the key themes we found from the report this year is that global peace is becoming increasingly unequal. So it's joining the inequality debate, if you will, that we have more around income inequality, where we see that Europe is reaching a high, Middle East and North Africa is reaching a low, and 2 billion people live in the bottom 20 countries. So the 20 least peaceful countries hold 2 billion of the world's population, and this is compared to the 20 most peaceful countries that only hold 500 million. So there is a cause for concern there. There's almost 3 times as many people living in the least peaceful countries. And these are places like Sudan, Somalia, Central African Republic, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. And now this violence comes at quite a cost. So we've estimated that $14.3 trillion is spent on violence containment in the past year. And this is roughly equivalent to just over 13% of the world's wealth. And this is when we're looking at 162 countries. And this number is increasing. If we were to reduce violence by just 10%, it could add $1.43 trillion to the global economy. And to put that money into perspective, 1.43 trillion is equivalent to 10 times official development assistance, 6 times the value of the bailouts for Greece. And so it's important to think about these numbers together in the aggregate, to think about how we can spend more efficiently and what might be sucking up our resources. Violence containment spending is inherently unproductive form of economic expenditure. And so what are we spending it on when we say that? Here you can see the categories that we include when we're looking at global violence containment costs, and they are across crime and interpersonal violence, which is about 28% of spending, military, which is about 43% of spending, conflict, which is about 11%, and internal security, which is about 18%. And it's increasing. So here you see that the conflict category is really accounting for most of these costs, and its internal conflict costs are going up, the costs associated with refugees, losses from conflict. The one area where we're seeing improvements are deaths from external conflict. Now, earlier I talked a little bit about the Positive Peace Index and how we look at positive peace. So what are those factors that you do want in society? And I think this is really some key areas of IEP's research, and it is part of our program that we're going to develop even more. So we are going to have a conference around positive peace on October 5th. At Stanford University, and everybody will receive an invitation to that. We're doing further research on positive peace, and we'll release a new paper on positive peace in September or October. And many of you have seen this framework before, and what it represents is statistical analysis where we have compared 8 years of Global Peace Index data to about 5,000 additional data sets to try to understand what are the strongest drivers of peace in the most peaceful countries. What are these factors that we see having the strongest correlation with the most peaceful societies? And so we have 8. And these 8 factors are not only interrelated, they're broad, and they're also composite. So I know there's often a question of, are you looking at gender equality? And we are. So when we're looking at acceptance of the rights of others and equitable distribution of resources and well-functioning government, all of these factors of positive peace include aspects of gender equality. So countries with higher levels of positive peace tend to have higher levels of gender equality. They have more women represented in parliament, and in their equitable distribution of resources, there's higher levels of gender equality. So just to be clear, these are also composite factors. High levels of human capital, for instance, includes youth development and access to education, and that's girls' education as well. It's important to note that this framework represents systems thinking and complexity theory. So these factors don't exist by themselves, they interact with each other. They do represent a preventive structure, so which areas we need to invest in to try to prevent conflict and reduce violent conflict. They are both informal and formal, so they're about attitudes as well as formal institutions. Countries that have strong levels of all of these tend to be more resilient and nonviolent, and they can act together in a cycle. So they evolve in a cyclical process where negative feedback loops can create vicious cycles of violence, whereas positive feedback loops can create virtuous cycles of peace. And when we see that, we try to test some of these factors and look back at the Global Peace Index. And what you're looking at here is that when we look at countries and trying to measure their levels of positive peace versus their levels of actual peace, so really one is looking at levels of violence versus potential capacity for change. And that really is a model of risk versus resilience, so that if you have weaker positive peace, you tend to be more vulnerable. If you have higher positive peace, you tend to be more resilient to shocks. And here you can see the countries that had, when we look back, lower levels of positive peace also then tended to fall in the Global Peace Index. And that's greater work that we're doing to try to look at risk analysis. But I'm not going to get too much into that here because it's a subject for a whole other webinar. And just to kind of reinforce that point, we looked at resistance campaigns, and we used Erica Chenoweth's a database around violent and nonviolent resistance campaigns and compared it to countries and their levels of positive peace. And what we found is that countries with stronger levels of positive peace tended to have either less resistance movements or more nonviolent resistance movements. And the point here is that every country experiences conflict of some kind. So when we are talking about Iceland or some of the Western European countries being some of the most peaceful, it doesn't mean that they are perfectly at peace and that they don't experience conflict. What it means is that they also have better abilities to manage conflict, and that conflict doesn't necessarily have to result in violence, in a violent outcome. And so I think this is an important slide to think about some of the ways to invest also in civil society. And so I think the main points from the report that we're looking at this year is that we're seeing now greater inequality in levels of peacefulness. So peace has been declining, but in certain areas it's on the up. You know, Europe is becoming more peaceful. Middle East and North Africa is less peaceful, so it's really a tale of two worlds. We spend a lot of money on violence and little money on building peace. So that 14.3 trillion is a very large amount of money, and it's not as productive as other areas. If you compare it to what we spend on peace building, what we can even add up in terms of peace building expenditures is less than 3% the total of our official development assistance, let alone how much we spend towards violence containment. And then finally, the need to shift the focus to positive peace, to prevention mechanisms, and to the long term. What the Peace Index shows is that once a conflict begins, it can quickly escalate and get worse. Syria is an example. And the costs are enormous, and the impact on development is critical. So here you can look at things like the urbanization challenge. Many fragile states are now urbanizing, and without building their levels of positive peace, they won't be able to manage that urbanization in a peaceful way. So I hope that this information has been interesting to everybody, and I am happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that great presentation. And we already do have a question from Cora. So Cora, give it 1 second. I'm going to unmute you and then just count to 3 before you start speaking. And then we should be able to hear you directly. Are you there, Cora?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Well, that's the first thing that's worked for me. I apologize. That was a really comprehensive and huge report, and I appreciate it a lot. I think the first thing that comes out of it is that the Peace and Security Funders Group should take a trip to Iceland and forget those other countries that you suggested, so they know what being numero uno in peace looks like. I can't find the United States. I have the global index in front of me. And would you repeat the number?
Yes, so the United States is ranked 94 out of 162.
Oh, I see it now. I just found it. Wow, that's pretty awful. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say people tend to look at who else, who a country is sort of surrounded by. So when you look at the United States, we're next to Peru and Saudi Arabia. But when you break it down and look at the indicators, there's very clear differences. So the U.S. score is really impacted by things like incarceration, involvement in external conflicts, nuclear weapon capabilities, and weapons exports, whereas Peru it would be more impacted by things like internal levels of conflict, interpersonal violence, etc.
Well, the list of things you've just given for being number 94 are pretty horrible, and nothing to be proud of, to have all of that intervention in foreign conflicts and nuclear weapons and more people in jail than anyone else. So it leaves us with a lot of work to do in our own country. I was glad to hear your comments about gender equality contributing to positive peace, because I did not hear that at the UN when you did the launch, or when they had the launch. Were you at the UN?
Yes.
I thought so, yeah. When they had the launch, and we had that rather long discussion about the role of gender in peacemaking, and
right.
To
well,
which
I
most
think,
of the guys said they agreed.
So I think there's two components to the gender conversation in terms of this index. There is not an indicator in the Global Peace Index around gender-based violence.
That's right.
There is a great desire to have an indicator around gender-based violence, but the data is just not there. So where you do have data, you would see things, and I think this was mentioned at the UN, like Sweden being the highest rate of domestic violence. That's because many more people are reporting domestic violence in Sweden than in other places, and so it's not really reflective of levels, it's reflective of a different system. We very much want to include a gender-based violence indicator. We have some other proposals to try to develop a separate index around that, because there is a massive dearth of data, and honestly, it's something that I would propose to the Peace and Security Funders Group, that they look at investing in increasing data capacity around gender-based violence. It's difficult to sell the idea of just data projects, but it is really necessary for that. In terms of positive peace, we absolutely include measures of gender equality within the positive peace factors, and they also correlate very strongly, so they are included there.
Thank you.
And then we just
don't forget Iceland.
Cora, I know that Alex and I
I'll go to Iceland. I definitely I've always wanted to go to Iceland.
They're actually starting a peace center in Reykjavik, so maybe we can all connect there and go for their grand opening.
When is that?
I'm not sure. I think they're just in concept stage right now, but I will definitely.
And what did you call it? A peace
PSF.
what?
They're starting a Peace Studies Center in Reykjavik, so I will absolutely keep PSFG informed of that when I get more information.
It was the site of the most important peace talk between Reagan and Gorbachev.
It's an interesting example, but it's maybe we'll do a whole webinar on Iceland one day.
Cora, did you have any other questions for Michelle?
No, that was fine. Thank you.
Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and mute you again, but if you do have another one, just shoot me an email and I will unmute you again. Michelle, we just had a comment from Tom Etzel, and he says, "Hi, Michelle. Thanks for the presentation. I read the reports after attending the event in Washington, D.C. on June 17th, and I tend to reference some of your data in op-eds and presentations. Great work."
Thanks, Tom. I encourage everybody to reference it in op-eds and presentations. But that said, also, if anybody has a program or a project, advocacy effort or communications, and would like some data to help support your position or wants to use some of the economic findings, for instance, we break down by country the costs of violence containment, and those can be a powerful tool for programs, so maybe some of your grantees to use to help make the case in the countries in which they work. It's sort of hard to get specific when you are talking about the whole world right now, and we don't have that much time, but just to say that if you do need any information, data points to help use in communications efforts, I'm happy to work with you to pull those out of the report as well, because it can be a little bit of a daunting 120 pages of facts and charts.
Thanks. And Tom also asks, would you be interested in coming to Pittsburgh for an advocacy event?
Yes, absolutely.
Great. I'm going to give everyone another minute or so to think of questions, and please, we really encourage you to raise your hand or write them in so that we can make most of Michelle's time with us. While we're doing that, Michelle, I know that you noted that we spend a lot of violence and a little bit on peace, and I just wanted to highlight the fact that PSFG is currently working with the Foundation Center to actually get an more accurate picture of what the funding landscape looks like for peace and security work. And so that's going to be coming out in January. And so then I think we'll actually be able to see a lot more clearly what that actual gap actually looks like. And then also looking at where there are gaps within the current peace and security funding landscape. So for everyone who's on today, please be on the lookout for that. And I see
I think that's really, it's really important work, because that understanding just doesn't exist, and it's very difficult to do. And I happen to be on the group that's working on that, so just to try to create the categories for understanding what peace building is or peace funding is. Peace building doesn't even have a agreed upon definition that everybody uses, so even then trying to tag funding to that is very difficult, but it's so essential, because if you think about the fact that if we can try to make the case for peace from a financial standpoint, from an economic standpoint, it can be so powerful. It's easier to show how much we're spending on violence containment, but people want to try to understand that if they invest in preventive measures, it actually is going to have a better economic outcome, and I think governments can be very swayed by that. And so it's trying to understand what investing in prevention is and how you can actually show the positive effects as well.
That is definitely true, and it's also interesting how we can't even come up with a common spelling for the word peace building. So I think that the field itself is full of its share of gaps and miscommunications, and we still have a long way to go there. And also, just to add to your point on the relationship, the economic costs of conflict and the benefits of peace, I'm sure you saw the recent RAND Corporation report on the costs of war on the economy in Israel and Palestine. So this is something that seems to be gaining traction outside of, it's getting more traction within the field itself. And actually, Patrick Hiller has a comment for you. He says, thanks for the great presentation. This is important data. At the conference, we already talked about how to communicate these findings to different constituencies, such as media, policymakers, practitioners. I'd be interested in hearing about the continued efforts by IEP to communicate these findings in an understandable and useful manner. So maybe if you want to talk a little bit about your outreach and how you're disseminating all of this great information.
Absolutely. So Patrick and I had a good time at the conference as well during the Federal Lobbying Day or Federal Advocacy Day, learning a little bit more about that. So we do spend a lot of resources and time on communications. One of the tools that we use is the website, and so I tried to show that there is an interactive element. You can explore every index we've done via those interactive maps by indicator, by country. You can send it to a friend, and it's actually used extensively as an education tool that way. We also try to make the report itself visually appealing, so we have a lot of infographics. We had something like 5,000 downloads of the report in the first couple of days, which actually is for like a quasi, this style of report is a lot. And we have tremendous traffic to the website because we also put a lot of effort into media. So we have hundreds of thousands of hits to the website. People spend, on average, 6 minutes on the website. So we have targeted a general public for that, and it's been quite effective. We get a tremendous amount of press, and we've done events so far since this index came out, which was on June 17th, in Washington, Oslo, Sweden, DC, Denver. I'm going to Mexico tonight because we have an event in Mexico City on Thursday, and we still have about 4 more European cities we're presenting in, as well as Australia, and then hopefully I'll be doing something with you, Patrick, maybe in the fall over your side of the coast. Another thing that I'm trying to do is to distill some of these findings for the U.S. Government and to look more at how we can be clearer about getting these messages across. So I've been talking to Peace Alliance, for instance, about their campaigns and their lobbying and advocacy efforts, and really trying to pull out pieces of information that can be used by others who are doing advocacy so that they become ambassadors of the information with their networks and with their tools.
Great. I just want to give everyone another opportunity to ask Michelle any additional questions you may have. We probably have more time for one more. So if you'd like to raise your hand or type your question in, we'll just give everyone 30 seconds now to do that. I don't see any other questions. Michelle, I'd like to give you the opportunity to take the next minute or so. Just if you have any follow-up comments, remarks, advice, or suggestions for those who are participating today, if they want to learn more or host an event, what do they do?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I encourage anybody to email me, and Rachel can throw out my email address on the chat because for some reason it's not letting me type in. But I think email me if you are interested in any of the following. One, are you a researcher or connected to researchers by any chance who want to play with the data? Somebody like Patrick, might be others not so much. I'm happy to put in data requests. If you want reports or information, let me know. We do a lot of presentations and we do a lot of travel amongst our small staff. So if there are opportunities for that, we're happy to come to you. So thank you, Tom, for the invitation there. Please check out the website. There are a lot of resources. There's a video, there's report, there's findings, there's maps. And if you have any questions about the methodology, what's included, if you're interested in one country's profile and to understand it better, I'm happy to go through that with you as well. And so my final sort of plug is that we really are trying to do more work around positive peace, and I will share that work with you as a community as it advances, and definitely send out an invitation to the October 5th conference at Stanford University once those go out later this month. And thank you all for spending so much time listening to this.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for taking the time to put on this webinar for everyone. It was really terrific, and we definitely would love to hear more about your positive peace work and prevention. As you know, we have the Conflict and Atrocities Prevention Working Group, and I know this information would be extremely helpful to them as they make the case to other funders to get more involved in prevention work to prevent all of this violence that we're trying to deal with here. Thank you, everyone, for participating. If you do have additional questions for Michelle, we will send out her contact information in our follow-up email, which you'll get in a couple of hours. You're also, as soon as we end the webinar, there's going to be a survey. It has 4 questions. If you could just quickly click on it and answer them, even if you just answer the first one, it's extremely helpful for us as we plan these webinars and future webinars. It's really great to have feedback, so we'd greatly appreciate it if you could take the survey. And also our next webinar, just to make a quick plug for that, is going to be on the Climate Security Nexus, and it's co-sponsored by the Environmental Grantmakers Association, and so we're going to be talking about how climate change impacts security, peace and security, and how grant makers should be considering that in their work. Again, thank you, Michelle, and thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a great day and enjoy the last day of June.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.